Hey, before you fall asleep, I want you to imagine something strange. Picture total silence. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just an empty desert stretching to the horizon. Then, a dune starts to hum. Not a hiss, not a rustle. A deep, sustained, almost musical note. Low enough to feel in your chest. Loud enough to hear from more than 6 miles away. No instrument, no machine, just sand. For over 2,000 years, people who heard this sound assumed something was buried underneath the dune. A bell, a monastery, a spirit. Today, we know it's real, it's physical, and it happens in fewer than 40 places on the entire planet. This is the story of the Whispering Dunes. Why some desert sand sings in low, booming notes, and what scientists had to do to finally prove it wasn't magic. More than 2,000 years ago, the Chinese historian Sima Qian recorded something strange happening at a dune ridge near the desert oasis town of Dunhuang. On calm, clear days, the sand there produced a sound resembling music. Travelers along the Silk Road passed this ridge for centuries afterward, and the name stuck, Mingsha Shan, literally the Singing Sand Mountain. It's still called that today. China wasn't alone. Across the deserts of the Middle East, similar sounds were documented in texts more than 1,000 years old, and they inspired similarly dramatic explanations. Travelers described tolling bells buried by sandstorms, underground drums, and desert spirits calling out to lure people off the trail. It's easy to understand why. Imagine walking across an empty landscape with no visible source of sound, and the ground itself starts to hum beneath your feet. It wasn't until the 20th century that anyone seriously investigated this as a physical phenomenon rather than folklore. In 1941, a British engineer and desert researcher named Ralph Bagnold, who had spent years studying how wind shapes sand dunes, published one of the first scientific treatments of the sound, describing it in almost as much wonder as the ancient travelers had, even while insisting it had a physical cause. He was right that it did. He just didn't yet have the tools to prove exactly how. That proof would take another 60 years, several international research teams, and in one case, a scientist rigging a seismograph to a sand dune and then sliding down it on purpose. But before we get to the physics, there's something important to clear up, because singing sand is actually 2 completely different phenomena wearing the same name. If you've ever walked barefoot on certain beaches and heard the sand squeak under your feet, you've technically already heard singing sand. That squeak is real. It's been measured by scientists, and it happens at dozens of beaches around the world. It's short, usually less than a second, high-pitched, typically somewhere between 500 and 2,500 hertz, closer to a chirp or a squeal. All it takes to trigger it is dragging your foot, poking the sand with a stick, or dropping a handful. It's relatively common and relatively well understood. Booming dunes are a completely different animal. Instead of a quick chirp, you get a sustained low tone, roughly 70 to 105 hertz, deep enough to feel as much as hear, that can last anywhere from several seconds to several minutes. Instead of a footstep, it usually takes an actual avalanche, a large mass of sand sliding down the steep face of a genuinely big dune, sometimes triggered by wind, sometimes by a person deliberately sliding down the slope to set it off. This is the sound our title is really asking about. The low note, the deep hum, the one so loud it's been compared to a foghorn, a low-flying propeller plane, and a cello note stretched out across an entire valley. And it is dramatically rarer than the beach squeak version. Out of the countless dune fields on Earth, geophysicists estimate that only about 30 to 40 locations produce a genuine, reliable boom. Why so few? Because booming turns out to require an oddly specific set of conditions, a kind of natural recipe that most sand on Earth simply doesn't meet. Pick up a random handful of sand anywhere on Earth, and the odds that it can boom are close to zero. Booming sand has to meet several strict conditions simultaneously, and losing even one of them is usually enough to silence it completely. First, grain size. The grains need to be small and remarkably uniform, typically somewhere between 0.1 and 0.5 millimeters across, with the best singers clustering even more tightly, often somewhere around 0.2 to 0.3 millimeters. Not a wide mix of big and small particles, a tight, consistent range, almost like the sand has been sorted by a machine. In most real dunes, wind and water mix grains of wildly different sizes together, which is enough on its own to kill the effect. Second, shape. The grains need to be well-rounded and smooth, generally polished over thousands of years by wind erosion, rather than jagged and angular like freshly broken rock. Rounded grains slide past each other more freely and consistently. Jagged ones catch, jam, and produce noise, not tone. Third, composition. The grains typically need a high silica content, and in many booming dunes, researchers have found the individual grains coated in an extremely thin, smooth silica layer, almost like a natural glaze, that helps them slip against each other with very low friction. Fourth, and arguably most important, dryness. Booming sand has to be bone dry. Even a small amount of moisture between grains changes how they interact enough to mute the sound almost entirely, which is exactly why booming dunes tend to show up in the driest desert environments on the planet, and why the same dune often goes quiet during or after rain. And finally, scale. This isn't something that happens with a handful of sand in your palm. It requires a genuinely large dune, tall enough and steep enough on its slip face to allow a substantial avalanche, often a slope of 100 feet or more. Because it turns out the sound isn't produced by a few grains rubbing together, it's produced by millions of them, moving as one. Which raises the real question: how do you get millions of individual, chaotic, tumbling grains of sand to somehow produce a single, clean, musical note, instead of just noise?
Here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. For over a century, nobody could fully explain this. And honestly, parts of it are still debated by scientists today, in published, ongoing research. We do know the basic starting point. When a big enough avalanche gets going on a booming dune slip face, the surface layer of sand doesn't just tumble down randomly. It shears, meaning the top layer slides across the layer beneath it, and as it does, individual grains catch and release against their neighbors in tiny, repeated stop-start movements, a behavior physicists call stick-slip friction. On its own, one grain doing this makes an insignificant click. But when millions of grains in the flowing layer start doing it in near-perfect synchrony, those tiny clicks stop canceling each other out and start reinforcing each other, building into one continuous, powerful tone. Essentially, the entire avalanche behaving like a single, enormous, accidental musical instrument. The genuinely unresolved question is what makes the grains lock into sync in the first place, and what determines the exact pitch. Two major research camps have offered different answers, and they still don't fully agree. The first came out of a joint Caltech and University of Cambridge project in the 2000s, led by researcher Natalie Vriend, along with Melanie Hunt and geophysicist Robert Clayton. They physically hauled seismic equipment out to booming dunes in California's Mojave Desert and Death Valley, Dumont, Eureka, Kelso, and Big Dune, and buried geophones in the sand to measure exactly what was happening beneath the surface during a boom. Their conclusion? The loose, dry surface layer of the dune sits on top of a denser, more compacted layer underneath, and that boundary acts like a natural waveguide, similar to the body of a guitar or violin,
trapping and amplifying sound waves at a specific frequency determined largely by the thickness of that dry surface layer. A separate team of French physicists, Stéphane Duwadi and Bruno Andreotti, argued something quite different, that the pitch isn't set by any hidden internal layering at all, but purely by the size of the sand grains themselves and the speed at which the avalanche shears. Under their model, the grains essentially self-synchronize as they flow, locking into a shared rhythm the same way a group of people walking together can unconsciously fall into step, and the resulting note is mathematically predictable from grain diameter alone.
Both teams have collected real field data. Both have published in respected physics journals. And as of now, the two explanations still don't fully agree with each other. Which means the honest answer to what exactly makes a dune boom is we understand the ingredients extremely well, and we're still refining the exact recipe. Few natural phenomena this dramatic remain this actively debated in modern science, which, if you ask me, makes it more fascinating, not less. What we can say for certain is this: it takes a very particular kind of sand, on a very particular kind of dune, moving in a very particular kind of way. And when all of those conditions align, physics turns a landslide into a drumbeat. So where on Earth can you actually witness this? In China, Mingsha Shan near Dunhuang remains one of the most famous sites curling around a crescent-shaped desert lake and drawing visitors along the same route Silk Road travelers used centuries ago. Nearby, the Badain-Jiran Desert holds some of the tallest stationary dunes on the planet, some over 1,300 feet high, and is home to some of the most powerful booming recorded anywhere. In the United States, California's Mojave Desert and Death Valley region hold an unusually dense cluster of booming dunes for one state. Kelso Dunes, Eureka Dunes, and Dumont Dunes among them, while Nevada's Sand Mountain and Colorado's Great Sand Dunes National Park, the tallest dune field in North America, both boom as well. Morocco's Erg Chebi on the edge of the Sahara is another well-documented booming site, along with dunes scattered across Namibia's Namib Desert and pockets of the Arabian Peninsula. Altogether, researchers put the global total at somewhere around 3 to 4 dozen confirmed locations, a strikingly small number for a planet covered in an almost unimaginable quantity of sand. Given how specific the conditions are, it's worth sitting with just how fragile this phenomenon really is. Booming dunes need a precise grain size, a precise shape, a precise dryness, and often undisturbed layering built up slowly over centuries. Heavy foot traffic, off-road vehicles, or anything that mixes grain sizes or compacts the surface can weaken or even silence a dune's song, sometimes permanently. Several researchers studying these sites have raised concerns that increased tourism and recreational vehicle use at some booming dunes could gradually mute a sound that took the desert centuries to tune. That fragility is part of what makes this phenomenon feel less like a curiosity and more like a genuine natural rarity worth protecting. Not unlike a coral reef or an old-growth forest. It isn't just sand. It's an extraordinarily specific, extraordinarily unlikely arrangement of grains, shape, dryness, and scale, tuned by wind over an immense span of time, into something that can, for a few brief seconds, sound almost deliberate. For most of human history, the only explanation anyone had for a hillside that hums was that something unseen must be underneath it. It took modern seismographs, physicists sliding down dunes on purpose, and decades of genuinely unresolved scientific debate to get us this close to the truth. And even now, this close is the honest answer. Nobody has fully closed the case. Somewhere out in the Mojave, or the Gobi, or the Sahara right now, a slope of sand is sitting in total silence, tuned by wind and time into something that, under exactly the right conditions, could sing. Most of it never will, but every so often, quietly, in the middle of nowhere, it does. If hidden physics behind the natural world fascinates you as much as it fascinates us, subscribe, because the planet has a lot more sounds like this one still waiting to be explained.
Good night. Sleep well. And I'll see you in the next Sleepy Science.